Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. Find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking with Will Friedman about current supply chain issues facing ports, in particular ports in the Great Lakes region. Now, Will is president and CEO of the Cleveland-Cuyahoga County Port Authority and also president of the American Great Lakes Ports Association. So he is really the perfect person to discuss these issues with us here today. So, Will, thanks so much for joining us, and we're really excited to have you here at Supply Chain University.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff, and it's great to be with you.
So you've had a very impressive career in the port space, and I'm wondering, just to get us started off, whether you could tell us a bit about your background before you came to the Port of Cleveland.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I grew up in Indianapolis, which is sort of a funny place for someone who ended up in the maritime and port world to be from, because there's no navigable water any place near Indianapolis. And I fell into this industry very fortuitously. At the end of a graduate program, I had gotten a referral to the person who at the time was running the ports of Indiana, which is a statewide port system, and launched my port maritime supply chain logistics career and haven't looked back. It's been great. I've had started out, as I mentioned, in Indiana, working for Indiana Ports. Only there about 2 years, less than 2 years, and I went west to the Port of Seattle, which for me was, really breaking into the big time. Seattle, if you're familiar with it, it's not only a big seaport, very diverse seaport with many lines of business, including being a major container port. It's also SeaTac International Airport. So I was really fortunate to work with great people there and get exposed to just about everything in our industry. And then got the opportunity to go back to Indiana, take over Indiana ports, where I had started 10 years later. I started at Seattle in 90, ended up back in Indiana in 2000, and was there for 4 years, and enjoyed that immensely and got to do a lot of things that were quite gratifying for Indiana ports, got some more exposure to the Great Lakes and also the inland waterway system at that point in my career. And then I joined a company that is very, very big in distribution center development across the U.S., Duke Realty Corporation, a REIT based in Indianapolis. And they needed someone like me who spoke ports because more and more of their business was being driven by both port activity and inland intermodal rail. Those were, hot locations, and e-commerce, of course, was starting to come on strong too. So, they really needed some help figuring out where should they expand. Yeah, I left Duke Realty Corporation in 2009 and joined the Port of Cleveland in 2010, and am very happy to be back in the port world here in Cleveland.
And what are your main job responsibilities as president and CEO of the port?
Well, we operate, even though we are a public agency, as are most port authorities, certainly all the public port authorities here in the U.S., but we operate much more like a business. So I have a board of directors I report to, a 9-member board. They're very business-like. And so my job is much like a CEO of a small to medium-sized company. Everybody is reporting up to me. I set strategy. I have to make sure my bosses, our board members, are happy with progress. I get to step in and solve some of the more intractable problems as they bubble up through the organization, and I get to sort of stick my fingers into everything here. So, I love what I do. Every day is different, and every day is a challenge.
And how are things going at the port these days?
Good. We've stabilized post-COVID. We're back to essentially pre-COVID levels of business activity. We're still facing the same challenges that we faced pre-COVID. we're like most businesses, we're slowly coming back together in person in a safe manner. We're hoping to continue on that path. A little uncertainty being thrown in everything now with this Delta variant, but
Right.
we're taking it one step at a time. And generally, we weathered the storm pretty well. We sort of were double whammied because even before COVID, the tariffs really impacted us here in Cleveland, particularly on steel. And so we're finding our footing here as we've come through all those tumultuous events of the last couple of years.
It sounds like steel is a primary industry that you work with there. What other industries do you tend to serve, and how's cargo volume?
Yeah, so the industries we serve, steel is certainly a big one here. We both make steel here in Cleveland. We still have an integrated steel mill and one of the larger mills in the United States. And recently was purchased by Cleveland Cliffs, a Cleveland-based company, which was a good development for us. And so our port is an important gateway for iron ore or taconite pellets that are necessary, and all the other raw materials that feed that steel mill. They all come through our harbor and our port. So that's our largest commodity by tonnage, and very important to our economy here. We also handle finished steel, quite a bit of it on a consistent basis, maybe 500,000 tons or so a year, sometimes more. That's coming in from Europe. These are specialty grades of steel that we don't make enough of in this country. These is not dumped steel. These are expensive grades of steel that are turned into battery casings or food and beverage cans, or go into automotive or appliance manufacturing for the most part. We handle other bulk cargoes here that are necessary for the construction industry, heavy construction industry like stone. We handle salt. We have a large salt mine here in Cleveland. And then a very important point of emphasis for us is we're trying to diversify, sort of move up the food chain into containerized cargoes, more finished goods, higher value goods, not just those basic commodities, but which are important, and we love those, but we want to diversify, and we want to spread our risk across a broader base of cargoes, and we want to be more relevant to more firms, more manufacturing companies, more distributors, and consumers here in our part of the U.S.
What are some of the, again, you've been there since 2010, what are some of the successes you've had at the port, and what are some of the challenges that you face? Yeah.
Well, let me unpack that a little bit. I just alluded to diversification, and that is our major challenge. We're fortunate to have some staple commodities, some things that move both overseas through the St. Lawrence Seaway and within the Great Lakes itself that are critical to our economy. But as I mentioned, we really want to diversify. So that means cracking into the world of container shipping. And there's a long history here, but when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up in the late 1950s, containerization was just getting started. It was in its infancy. Some of your audience may have read some of the histories, which are fascinating, on containerization. The very first container ship moved from the East Coast to the Gulf into Houston in 1956, and the St. Lawrence Seaway opened in 1959. And when it first opened in that first decade, we were quite diversified here in Cleveland and the other major Great Lakes ports. We were seeing all kinds of cargoes from Europe and from around the world, anything from fully finished cars that would move through here, barrels of whiskey from Europe and other parts of the world, consumer goods, as well as heavy equipment and machinery, industrial parts, etc. And then a lot of that went away as the container shipping lines, started to kind of strive for ever increasing efficiencies and consolidate into the big container gateways. They really went away from the Great Lakes, and I don't think the governmental bodies that regulate and administer the system really saw what was happening before it was too late. So we're sort of left with this system that has a lot of capacity. And so when I got here in 2010, to make a very long story short, we set a goal to try to really kind of disrupt that status quo and bring container shipping back into the Great Lakes again. And not easy, and we're still working on it. We have, I'd say, to answer your question, my biggest achievement since I've been here has been that we started the Cleveland Europe Express service in 2014. We, the Port Authority, actually time chartered a ship. Went to the ship owner and said, "Hey, we'll rent your ship, and we'll pay you a fee to manage moving containers back and forth from Cleveland to Antwerp, a major container port in Europe." And that's a fairly crazy notion for a port authority. It's a little analogous to an airport saying, "Well, let's start an airline," which you don't see every day. So, but we felt like we needed to do that based on the circumstances, and I'm glad we did it. We've learned a lot. We're still going. 2021, and the service is still up and running. It's now completely independently run by Steptoe. They're a Dutch vessel owner operator, mostly a break bulk carrier. They operate what we refer to as multi-purpose vessels, but they can carry containers as well. So we want to expand on that service. We work very hard to try to attract other carriers back into the system to carry containers on a scheduled basis. Right now, with everything going on in the world of supply chain, all the disruptions, all the difficulties that shippers are having, I think we need this now more than ever. So I think we may speak more about that later. But that's been the problem we've attacked the hardest.
Right. And I think we're, as we move into this discussion of how to improve competitiveness of the port and Great Lakes ports, and I think two things I would note is one. Your background is really perfect for, thinking about this, right? Because you worked at ports in the Great Lakes, you worked at Port of Seattle, you worked at, ports in the inland waterway system. East Coast ports pretty well from some of your other work. When I was at Commerce, one of my colleagues said, "If you've seen one port, you've seen one port." And so I think, you've lived that, you understand that the challenges are different, and there are also different challenges for Great Lakes ports versus coastal ports. So I think that's the first thing, that sensibility that you bring to this, which I think is incredibly useful. The other thing that we should tell viewers is that, Will and I both serve on the board of directors for the Council of the Great Lakes region. And so we think about these issues all the time in terms of how do we improve the economic competitiveness of the region, how do we improve the sustainability of the Great Lakes. Those are really important. And so, bearing all of that in mind, what are some of the things, you think we can do to improve the competitiveness of the Port of Cleveland and the ports in the Great Lakes more generally, recognizing, as you said before, that in terms of containers, when as container trade took off, that mostly moved to the coasts. So how do we bring that into the Great Lakes?
Yeah, that's a question that I have spent many hours pondering and trying to turn into reality here. It's not an easy question. My views on it are somewhat controversial, at least perhaps to some. There are many who say, well, container shipping just can't work in the Great Lakes. You're not competitive, and sort of, full stop, end of story. And I just don't believe that. I think that's not true. When the system opened, it was open to great fanfare by Queen Elizabeth on behalf of Canada, who was still the sovereign of Canada at that time, and by Dwight Eisenhower in 1959. And their speeches were all about how this was going to be the fourth coast for the U.S. And it just never, unfortunately, came to be. But we can be. There's still huge upside for this system. Lots of capacity out there. The St. Lawrence Seaway is running at best 40-50% capacity. And my view is it's mostly policy. It's mostly changing policy inertia. We were stuck running the system. When I say we, there are a number of agencies involved, of course. This is a binational system across two borders. And those agencies, all those very well-intentioned people in the government on both sides, I think, have just been unable to sort of move past the paradigm they've been in now for 50 years. As we were chatting before this, I showed you some data. I showed you a chart, which is sort of an X chart with world trade since 1970, 50 years worth, and St. Lawrence Seaway trade since 1970. And world trade, of course, is this line that's moving up steeply to the right-hand corner of that graph. And St. Lawrence Seaway trade is moving downward. And this is over the same 50 years that globalization has occurred, which just sort of boggles the mind. And to me, that isn't just the market operating here. This is a market that has gotten distorted because of the way these systems are being run. What do I mean by that? That all sounds very academic and general. Well, closing it down in the winter would be the prime example. Since the beginning, the Seaway, the St. Lawrence Seaway, a series of locks to get ships up and down past obstructions like Niagara Falls and others. It's been essentially closed in the winter. And there were reasons for that, of course. You need to close and do maintenance. There's ice. The weather's very bad. We're up here, northern hemisphere. And those all are very real, and no question about it. But there are other systems like ours, navigation systems, that operate throughout the year. They figured out how to overcome those constraints. And they've done the cost-benefit analysis, and they've convinced themselves that, it may cost a little bit more to keep this system open, and there are going to be some problems we're going to have to overcome, and there may even be some objections. There can be environmental concerns, which are certainly real and would need to be addressed. But they've concluded it's worth it because, we're allowing 12 months worth of trade to flow in and out, and we're fully utilizing a waterway. I mean, look at a map. This, St. Lawrence Seaway, Great Lakes serves a $5.5 trillion region, one of the largest economic regions in the world if you add up the GDPs of the Great Lakes states and provinces. It's the world's breadbasket. It's a manufacturing powerhouse. It just makes no sense that we don't have more deep water shipping into this region. And that's really, as you can tell, that's what I'm passionate about. And I think it's largely sort of a re-education process and overcoming, as we know, in the world of, and I know, in the world of the government, changing the status quo is a very hard thing to do.
It seems like this would help. You talked about steel earlier. You've talked about broader manufacturing, agriculture. I would also think that, right now the administration is going through this comprehensive exercise on supply chain strategy. And I would think, having more trade through the Fourth Coast would also improve supply chain resilience, give exporters in the region another option. Potentially, you could look at it as a national interest, having that other option be more robust would also help enhance national security, right?
I think it checks every box that the Biden administration, Secretary Buttigieg, this administration that's still in its early months has been talking about so much. And you just, mentioned a number of them. Sustainability, shipping by water is, certainly is going to cut carbon. We're going to get goods in and out of the heartland of America with less carbon emission. You mentioned national security. I do think there's a national security facet to this issue as well, especially when you look at moving, for example, we move a lot of steel in here. Steel goes into essential goods, things like battery casings. The Biden administration has been stressing EVs, electric vehicles, and the electric vehicle supply chain. Well, virtually every battery casing made in America is using steel coming through our port. So right. When you look at just sort of, raising GDP. When you look at exports, huge problem, predates today's issues in the supply chain. Both agricultural and manufacturing exporters have struggled for years to get the kind of service consistently that they need from the shipping lines. The FMC is now, as you know, taking this up, taking a very hard look under an executive order from the president.
Right.
Our ports are poised to be part of that solution. You can get a container to our port. We're very fluid. You can get it on a ship, and you can connect into the global container shipping network in Cleveland, Ohio. And when we explain this, when I talk to exporters about this, manufacturers here, their eyes just light up. I mean, they want this. This is a situation where we know shippers want it. We know demand is there. We know volume is there. We just have some structural problems where we can't get demand synced up here with supply, that being the ocean carriers and the third-party logistics providers who are the intermediaries in that business. It's just a different way of doing business, and they're resistant right now. And ship owners see too much friction coming into the system, which is real. And so we need the government, Canadian and the U.S. government, in my opinion, to work on taking that friction out. There are ways to take it out. And some of those friction points are the closure. Some of it might be I can't get a pilot on board my ship in a timely manner, and I'm sitting and I'm waiting and I'm delayed, and it blows up my schedule. Some of them might be, gee, I'm worried about ballast water. Can I discharge ballast water inside the Great Lakes? What are the rules? What are the regulations? All these things which can be solved for, but you've got to have an intention to do it.
I think you've anticipated my next question, and I think you've really covered. We need to work with Canada. We need to work through some of the policy issues, as you mentioned. Potentially, there's funding involved. Right? Need to get, and probably at federal and state level as well. And also, there's the market issue, as you mentioned. And resetting expectations. I'm wondering, sort of, as a last question, I know given the experiences you've had at different ports, what are some of the lessons you've learned from that, and how might those bear on potentially a solution to this issue?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna. If you bear with me, I'm going to back up just a second. There are a couple more things I wanted to say.
Oh, sure, please.
Pertaining to that last question, and I'll segue into your last question. Biden administration, of course, is also emphasizing environmental justice and equity, equal access to opportunity. I also think shipping through the Great Lakes, although, people might say, well, how do you connect those dots? But, places like Cleveland, places like Detroit, we need economic development. We need ways to compete. And if our ports thrive, if we have very, very high functioning connections, global connections to the rest of the world, we're going to be more competitive. We're going to be able to attract business, keep companies here. So there really is a direct line, in my opinion, between how do we help places like Cleveland, Ohio, that have had pervasive poverty, that have struggled over the years, have seen an exodus of good jobs, the Rust Belt story that we all know so well. Well, this is a way to do that. I'm firmly convinced, and I think we're going to press that case as well. But to your question of what have I learned over the years, I think I already mentioned it. It's just I've always been, for better or for worse, I always sort of look at the way things are and try to find the way to make something work better, and that means change. And people, institutions, systems don't change easily, and so I think I've tried to figure out how do you make that change happen, but you have to do so in a way that, and this is one of those learnings, you you have as you get a little older is you got to do so in a way that doesn't burn bridges. I mean, you have to work with people who may initially disagree with you, who may always disagree with you, may never agree with you, but you're going to encounter them again, and you have to think to yourself, I want to do this in a way that I can maintain a relationship with that person, even if we didn't agree. And so it's been this sort of a balance in my career between, pushing up against status quo, but doing it in a way that preserves my ability to operate successfully, and then just trusting yourself. As I've gone along in my career, I don't know how many times you probably had this experience where you have an idea, you think about something, and you don't act on it, and then later on somebody else has that idea and they go out and they do it, or it happens anyway, and you think to yourself, boy, I should have just trusted my gut, and why didn't I say what I should have in that meeting, or taken my idea and run with it. And you get to a point in your career where you're like, yeah, I'm just going to go for it. So that would be my advice to anybody. In terms of profound learnings about our supply chain, about transportation, I do think we need, very generally, I would love to see this administration, future administrations, start to take a real sort of fresh look at transportation in this country. I think we're due for an overhaul. I think we've been doing the same thing over and over again for a long time here. The way we fund transportation, the modes we emphasize, we should look at Europe. We should look at other parts of the world. I think there's a lot for us to learn.
I think those are great lessons to live by. And in terms of being proactive and pushing out new ideas, and having the administration take a second look at these issues, this is really a great time. I think as we've talked about this before, when I was working on supply chain policy for Commerce Secretary Pritzker, if someone would have come into me at that point and said, we need to rethink transportation policy, or we want to, rebuild this supply chain or that supply chain, that wasn't really something that was going to be on the table. And I was fighting to get attention to, for these kind of supply chain issues. Now a lot of those things are totally what folks are looking for a variety of reasons. And when you have moments like that, ideas that have been incubating for a while, now they're going to have that audience. So, this is as good a time as any to have that conversation. And I know from discussions I've had with lots of agencies that they are really thinking about this and looking for new ideas. And I think, these ideas and your experience, working in the industry, from across all those different areas, I think this is the time to have those discussions. So, I really appreciate your coming on, Will, and look forward to continuing this really fascinating discussion as these issues develop.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Jeff.
And that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.